morning, everyone, or good evening, depending on where you are. Welcome to GW Institute for Korean Studies, or GWIKS. I'm Yeon-ho Kim, Associate Director of GWIKS here. Thank you for joining our North Korea Economic Forum panel discussion, co-hosted with the Institute for Peace and Unification Studies at Seoul National University. We're providing simultaneous interpretation service today. So if you look at the bottom of your screen, there is a globe icon where you can choose either English or Korean. Now let me turn it over to Ji-Soo Kim, Director of GWIKS, and Bum-Soo Kim, Director of the Institute for Peace and Unification Studies, for opening remarks. Ji-Soo?
Great. Good morning, everyone. I'm Ji-Soo Kim, as introduced, Director of the Institute for Korean Studies. I would like to first thank our co-sponsor, the Institute for Peace and Unification Studies at Seoul National University, especially Director Bum-Soo Kim and his staff. And also, I'd like to thank distinguished speakers for participating in our panel discussion, which seems to be very timely and important one. I hope it will draw a lot of attention. And also thanks to the steering committee of North Korea Economic Forum, Bill Brown, who's the chair, Bill Newcomb, Rachel, Troy, and Yeon-ho. I would like to especially thank them because they always are striving to come out with ideas for the point of discussions that we generate here in DC. And finally, but not least, thanks to our staff members of GWIKS for managing all the logistics to make our events run smoothly. I know the topic today regarding revisiting North Korean sanctions, we didn't expect or intend to happen at this time. I mean, related to the closing of relating to the seas at the end of April, related to the UN panel regarding the sanctions on North Korea. So I am very much looking forward to the discussions this morning and learn about what we might expect going forward. So without further ado, then I will turn it over to Director Bum-Soo Kim for his remarks.
Good morning for American audience and good night for Korean participant. My name is Bum-Soo Kim, Director of the Institute for Peace and Unification Studies at Seoul National University. First of all, on behalf of the Institute for Peace and Unification Studies, I would like to welcome all of you to join this webinar, co-hosted by Institute for Korean Studies at George Washington University. The Institute for Peace and Unification Studies at Seoul National University, which was established in April 2006, has hosted various seminars, forums, workshops, international conference to examine North Korea and North Korea-related issues. Today, with the generous support from the Institute for Korean Studies at George Washington University, we are very pleased to co-host the third webinar titled Revisiting Sanctions on North Korea. As many of you already know, and Professor Ji-Soo Kim already mentioned, with the Russian veto, the United Nations panel of experts on sanctions on North Korea will start its operation at the end of this month, so just 1 week later. So as a result, it is expected that the sanction regime on North Korea will be weakened and sanction violation will increase in the near future. Under this situation, I think it is very timely and relevant to examine sanctions on North Korea. I hope all of you enjoy today's webinar. Finally, I would express my sincere thanks to Director Ji-Soo Kim, Professor Yeon-ho Kim, and staff of GW Institute for Korean Studies for coordinating and preparing all the arrangements. And great thanks to our distinguished speakers, Mr. Jendo Hwang, Dr. Jongmin Lee, Professor Sang-Sung Lee, and Mr. Eric Phantom for their presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Bum-Soo and Ji-Soo. Now, let me start the panel discussion by briefly introducing the speakers. In the interest of time, I'd like to ask the audience to refer to our event announcement for the full bio of each speaker. The first speaker is Jenda Huang, the publisher of Prohibited Transactions, a newsletter about the economic and geopolitical forces shaping the illicit financial activities of North Korea and Iran. He previously covered sanctions and proliferation finance issues for HSBC Hong Kong's financial crime analysis team and for Wells Fargo's Global Financial Crimes Intelligence Group. The next speaker is Sang-Suk Lee, a research professor at the Korea National Diplomatic Academy and an adjunct professor at Dongguk University. She previously served as a visiting professor in Peking University and a member of the National Unification Advisory Council in South Korea. Our third speaker is Jung-min Lee, an economist of the North Korean economy at the Bank of Korea Economic Research Institute. Before joining the BOK, he served as a senior fellow at the Institute for Peace and Unification Studies at Seoul National University. So one of the main reasons he was willing to join us today, I guess. Last but not least, we have Eric Patton Volk, a former British government official with 30 years experience of foreign and security policy issues. After leaving government service, he was appointed the coordinator of the UN panel of experts for DPRK, a role he held for 2 years before leaving in April 2023. With that, Jenda, let me start with you. I'd like to ask you about the changing North Korea's relations with Russia and sanctions violations. I think this is basically what made us get together today. What's your take on that?
Yeah, definitely. Well, hello everyone. And first, I just want to thank the Institute for Korean Studies and the Institute for Peace and Unification Studies for inviting me to participate on the panel and to Bill Newcomb for suggesting me in the first place. My name is, as said, my name is Jenda Huang, and I have a background in banking and anti-money laundering, having served on the financial crime intelligence teams, 2 large international banks, both here in the US and in Hong Kong. And yeah, my primary focus on those teams was sanctions and proliferation finance issues, especially as they related to North Korea. And currently I publish a newsletter called Prohibited Transactions, following the economic and geopolitical forces shaping all the illicit networks of Iran and North Korea. So yeah, today I'm just going to talk a little bit about North Korea's evolving illicit relationship with Russia and really what it means in the context of the sanctions regime. I think as much as the two countries really complain about the illegitimate nature of sanctions directed against them, obviously it's something they can't ignore. It's something they have to figure out a way to deal with. And I mean, it really is a two-way street, right? Sanctions can limit and constrain Pyongyang and Moscow's options, but the actions that the DPRK and Russia take do really affect the sanctions regime. And I think a recent example of this, which has already been mentioned, is the Russian veto of the UN Security Council resolution, which would have extended the mandate of the panel of experts for another year. But instead, right, the panel has 1 week of life kind of left in it. So I think how did we get to this point? Now, obviously, Russia and North Korea have had a long history going back to the Korean War, but I think the simplest place to start is really with Kim Jong-un and Vladimir Putin's first meeting in April 2019. Now, around this time, Russia's relationship with the DPRK was really more subordinate, I think, to China's relationship with North Korea. Because, like in 2018, Russia's trade with North Korea totaled $34 million, whereas trade between North Korea and China was, $2.4 billion. China really accounted for 90% of North Korea's total trade during this period of time. And, there's so many illicit links between the two countries in terms of, North Korean hackers and cyber criminals being based out of northeastern China, Chinese companies evading sanctions to do business with the North, and North Korean front companies really operating out of China. But I think at this time, Russia's relationship with the DPRK really seemed to have 3 main facets. The first was that, Russia, along with China, was sending refined petroleum to the DPRK, which was, allowed by the UN as long as it was less than 500,000 barrels a year. So the second facet was, something I always noticed in the panel of experts reports was that, there are always North Korean banking officials really operating out of Russia, which I always found that to be interesting, since it seemed to me at least, that the primary economic relationship between the two sides was really this third facet, which is North Korean overseas workers. So I think, according to official, Russian government numbers that were provided to the UN in December of 2018, there were about 12,000 North Koreans with valid work permits in Russia. But I think the general understanding at that time was that there could be up to 50,000 North Korean workers in Russia, having entered the country through various visa schemes and, primarily engaged in construction and logging work. And by December 2019, a year later, Russia reported that the number of North Korean workers was down to about 1,000, which would make it seem like Moscow was really adhering to UN Security Council Resolution 2397, which required all North Korean or overseas North Korean workers to return home by December 2019. But I think also, open source reporting was saying that in 2019, Russia had issued approximately 27,000 student and tourist visas to North Koreans. So it seems like, despite the December 2019 deadline imposed by the UN, which is something, Russia voted in favor for, the country still was welcoming in North Korean workers, under the guise of being, students or tourists or whatnot, in order to try and address Russia's labor shortage. And, these overseas workers could always, are able to continue to raise funds on behalf of Pyongyang. So I think broadly speaking, during this time when Kim and Putin are going to meet, Moscow is still adhering to the international sanctions regime technically, but they're exploiting what loopholes that they can, and then they're really working to weaken it as well. I think the other thing to remember is that this meeting with Putin actually takes place about 2 months after the Hanoi summit between Kim and former US President Donald Trump. And I mean, if you remember back then, the Hanoi meeting had ended early. There was no agreement or joint statement by the two sides. They'd really been unable to come to terms about denuclearization and sanctions relief. And according to the DPRK's foreign minister at the time, North Korea had asked for the lifting of UN sanctions imposed since 2016, which had been targeting Pyongyang's export of coal, iron, minerals, and as well as the import of oil. But I think one thing, even if the North Koreans had really gotten the sanctions relief that they wanted, I think they would have experienced the same issues that the Iranians faced with the JCPOA, which is really that, governments and the UN, they can lift all the sanctions that they want, but, businesses and banks really have their own risk calculations to take into account. And they're not just going to start trading or, facilitating payments with a country that, just because a number of sanctions have been lifted off of it. There's all these other issues related to it as well. So I think nothing really comes from Kim and Trump's meeting. And then after that, Kim ends up accepting this longstanding invitation to go to Russia. So even this meeting between Kim and Putin is a little more symbolic than substantial. There's not really any big announcement or any kind of declaration by Russia, for example, that they're gonna, start ignoring sanctions for the benefit of North Korea. So it really just seems that the status quo is remain as is. And then COVID happens, right? North Korea closes their border and stopped all movement into the country on January 25th, 2020. So that includes really not letting their overseas workers return, many of them who then become stuck in Russia and in China. And then during that time, Moscow had reported about 500 North Koreans were stranded in Russia. But it seems to be an undercount. And even if it was accurate, by the first quarter of 2020, after the DPRK had said that they closed their borders in both directions, Russian data actually showed almost 7,000 North Koreans had entered Russia as tourists, students, or workers, or uncategorized category, basically. So I think other than taking in more workers, not much is overtly happening in the relationship between the two countries, especially as North Korea is really, self-isolating and cut itself off from the world, kind of in some ways maybe better than any other sanctions could. And then if we kind of jump forward a bit to February 2022, Russia invades Ukraine. North Korea is, one of the few countries in the world that is supporting Moscow and recognizes some, the breakaway regions in Ukraine. And already by September of that year, North Korea is being accused by the US of selling artillery shells and rockets to Russia. And in December, North Korea is accused of supplying arms to the Wagner Group. I think by this point, Kim Jong-un, must have given up really on the idea of coming to any sort of accommodation or agreement with the US and the West in terms of denuclearization and sanctions relief. And I think instead, the invasion of Ukraine is really a geopolitical opportunity for the DPRK to strengthen its ties with Russia. First of all, right, Russia has turned into kind of a fellow sanctioned pariah state, which is slowly getting cut off from other Western economies. And I think in the past, right, Russia may have wanted to keep some distance from the DPRK in order to be able to maintain their access to Western markets. But really, with the US and all these other countries trying to cut off Russia's fund flows, Moscow doesn't really have a lot to lose if it moves closer to Pyongyang. And I think secondly, right, a lot of North Korean munitions are based off of older Soviet designs and compatible with Russian weapons. So Pyongyang is, more than willing to exchange or sell these weapons for food, for oil, for technology from Russia. So unlike their April 2019 meeting, when Kim and Putin meet in September of 2023, there appears to be a lot more tangible results. Just weeks after their meeting, satellite imagery has shown like increased freight rail car activity on the border between the two countries, which was likely weapons going from North Korea to Russia. So I mean, I won't go into any detail because there's so much open source reporting by RUSI, CSIS, Beyond Parallel, 38 North, and the panel of experts, and many others really just tracking the movement of goods between North Korea and Russia, which I think continues to this day and likely will keep going on beyond. So I think this exchange of weapons and oil and technology is also fueling another level, like of financial warfare, as the U.S. and the West really try and counter the moves of Pyongyang and Moscow, that are making that the moves that they're making to facilitate this trade. I mean, for example, in February, I think there was U.S. media reporting that Moscow had released $9 million out of 30 million in frozen DPRK funds that had been deposited at a Russian bank, and a U.S. official said that this money was going to be used to buy oil. And I was only able to find, there's just that one New York Times article about it, so I couldn't find anything else in terms of like which bank this money was in, or why was it even frozen in the first place, or why only some of the funds are being released. And it was also reported that a North Korean front company has opened an account at a Russian bank in South Ossetia, which is self-proclaimed independent state with close ties to Russia. I think this is a interesting development as well, if Russia's allowing their maybe slowly starting to allow their banking sector to be used by the North Koreans. And of course, if Western banks aren't really careful, there could be a lot of something called like nested correspondent banking risk, because they could unwittingly process transactions for this front company or for other front companies that may have accounts at Russian banks. I think the actions that North Korea and Russia are taking are half the equation, right? On the other hand, North Korean front companies in East and Southeast Asia at this point in time, I think, are vulnerable to being caught up in U.S. sanctions directed against Chinese financial institutions, as well as being de-risked from various banks. And what I mean from this is, in this first situation, right, North Korean front companies have accounts at mainland Chinese banks, and they may think that they have a layer of insulation from Western sanctions. But recently there's been talk by the U.S. government of possibly sanctioning some Chinese banks or companies in relation to Beijing sending weapons-related technology to Russia. And then if that's the case, these North Korean front companies could lose their access to the international financial system. And then in the second situation, I think North Korean front companies are likely to have accounts at banks in Hong Kong, for example, so they can transact with their Russian counterparts. And these front companies could suddenly find their accounts closed, but it's not because they've been identified as a North Korea, tied to North Korea or anything like that. But it's because a lot of international banks in Hong Kong are going through their own de-risking exercises, and they just want to exit customers that are transacting at a high volume with any Russian-based counterparties. So it's really, I think, moves and counter moves as both sides fight for a financial edge. And I mean, when you think about all of this, the history and what's going on right now, it's in some ways, maybe it's no surprise that Russia vetoed the UN panel of experts. Now, of course, there'll be other organizations and experts out there that will continue to track, the sanctions violations by Pyongyang and by Moscow. But I think a very authoritative voice is going to be lost next week. The panel's reports were really a consistent standard, and it's one that my work when I was in the banks and the work of many of my banking colleagues all around the world really benefited from. I think the panel's reports helped shed a light, especially on kind of that gray zone of companies, which are ones that haven't been sanctioned by the UN or the US and the EU, but are still caught up in one way or another with all the illicit activities that North Korea has been engaged in. So I think maybe, in the long term, Russia and North Korea may come to regret shutting down the panel if this, ends up spurring the creation of something even more effective to monitor Pyongyang's illicit activities. But, I think in this day and age too, right, it's very impossible to separate sanctions from geopolitics. And it's especially true in the case of Russia and North Korea's illicit relationship. So I think for now, I'll just leave it at that, and then, happy to have further discussion later on. Thank you.
Thank you, Jenda. Thank you for your comprehensive overview of what has been going on surrounding the North Korea and Russian relationship. I think you provided us with some fruitful thoughts. Let me move on to our next topic, which is China's role here. Sang-suk, I think China is in a very unique position now. They don't seem to be super excited about enforcing sanctions against North Korea, but I guess they don't want to take all the blames either. So what's your take on that?
Yes. Hello, everyone. Good morning or good night. I am Sang-suk Lee, research professor for Korean National Diplomatic Academy. Thank you for inviting me. Special thanks to Ji-Soo Kim, director of GW Institute for Korean Studies, Bum-soo Kim, director of Institute for Peace and Unification Studies, Seoul National University, and Professor Yeon-ho Kim. My topic is China cooperating enough? I want to answer no, not enough. Let's talk about the effectiveness of economic sanctions. First, what should not forget is that economic sanction is political decision. The economy is the means, and the point is politics. Margaret P. Doxey said, because of 78% of sanctioned countries are ruled on authoritarian government, the effectiveness of most economic sanctions was limited in the past 30 years. On the contrary, rally around the flag effect, there is a domestic cohesion effect could happen in the sanctioned authoritarian system, and we should also consider the appearance of black knights. The black knights of North Korea, China, and Russia. Next, I talk about North Korea economic situation. North Korea economy specialist Dr. Lee will talk about this part, so I will talk briefly. North Korea is optimistic about its economy this year. According to Nodong newspaper, North Korea's Supreme People's Assembly has designed the National Fiscal Management Plan as follows. The blue line is VAT, and the orange line is corporate tax in the graph. Look at the graph, both lines are increasing in 2024. And North Korea expected the fiscal revenues to expand between 2023 and 2024. The blue line is budget revenue, and the orange line is the budget expenditure in the graph. Look at the graph. North Korea also plans to increase on both budget revenue and budget expenditure in 2024. And North Korea's exchange rate recovered to October 2019 level before COVID-19 period. During COVID period, North Korea's dollar exchange rate is unstable, but after November 2022, it is stable. North Korean dollar exchange rate is 80,300 North Korean won against $1 as of October 2023. Additionally, North Korea's grain prices stabilized on the decline. The red line is the flour price, the blue line is the rice price, and dotted line is corn price. With the exception of flour, North Korean grain prices were relatively stable during COVID-19 period. I'd like to move to North Korean economic cooperation with China. China accounted for about 90% of North Korea trade during Kim Jong-un leadership era. However, North Korea's trade with China posted the second straight year of negative growth due to economic sanctions from 2017 to 2018. This is a time when China has complied well with the economic sanctions, and North Korea trade with China posted the third straight negative growth due to COVID-19. However, North Korea trade with China in 2023 is expected to be similar to that in 2018. It has recovered to pre-COVID-19 levels. Let's look at the current economic sanctions on North Korea. According to 2023 expert panel report, it was estimated that illegal refined oil imports amount to 1 million barrels or 1.5 million barrels in 2023. The report estimated 0.1 million North Korean overseas workers in 2023. It estimated that they earn $500 million of income a year. The report also estimated that North Korean cyber attack recorded $750 million in 2023. Finally, I talk about China policy toward the North Korean economic sanctions. China officially agreed to and complied well with UN economic sanctions on North Korea, but 3 northeastern provinces of China are likely to engage in illegal trade transactions. For example, oil supply through a pipeline and luxury or dual-use items import and international maritime transactions. This year marks the 75th anniversary of diplomatic relations between North Korea and China. We have to pay attention to countries' IT industry and tourism cooperation this year. China's ambassador Wang Yajun met Ri Jung-gil, the chair of North Korea Science and Technology Committee. And he visited the Goryeo Royal Tomb last month. In conclusion, I think that the limited effects of economic sanctions on North Korea due to North Korea's authoritarian system and the appearance of black knights. Major black knights are Russia and China. China's policy regarding North Korea economic sanctions is officially complied well, but China is an unofficial black knight. For example, oil imports, international maritime transaction, overseas workers, and cyber activities. Especially, North Korea IT workers can win a job without confirming their nationality in cyber labor network. Economic cooperation between North Korea and China is expected to expand this year. So I think China's cooperation is not enough. Thank you for listening my presentation.
Thank you, Sang-soo. I think from now on, everybody will know who we're talking about when somebody talks about black knights regarding sanctions on Korea. Thank you. Thank you. Let me ask Chung-min to discuss the impact of changing a sanctions landscape on the North Korean economy. What do you see in your crystal ball, Chung-min? I guess Chung-min just converted his crystal ball into some PowerPoint slides. So
okay, I have my slides. So yeah, let me share my screen with you. Okay. Can you see my slide?
yeah, yes, perfect.
Yes. Okay. Let me begin. Thank you for introducing me. I am Jong-min Lee, an economist from the Bank of Korea. Nice to meet you. It is a great honor for me to participate in this important and timely webinar. Today, my topic is about the impact of changing sanctions landscape on the North Korean economy. So, before starting the presentation, I'd like to note that any views expressed herein are solely those of the presenter and should not be taken to reflect those of the Bank of Korea. Okay. Let me begin with talking about the North Korean economy under the sanctions and the COVID-19 pandemic. From 2017 to 2022, the North Korean economy had been subject to two major external shocks. One is sanctions and the other is COVID-19. Due to the two shocks, its GDP decreased like a stair step. The average annual growth rate during this period was minus 2.0%. It can be translated into 11.5% of cumulative reduction in real GDP. The decline in GDP is significant enough to counteract the growth in the early and middle of the 2010s. North Korea's major industries that had driven economic growth have been hit hard by the sanctions and the COVID-19 pandemic. Mining and heavy manufacturing industries showed lowest growth rate in 2017 and 2018 as a result of UN sanctions that banned export of mineral product and import of mechanical equipment. During the pandemic period, light manufacturing and service sectors suffered severely in the aftermath of border closures. And there are several studies that investigate the impact of sanctions. They are based on various sources of data, and but they reported similar results. For example, Kim et al. 2023 employed satellite nighttime light data to find that the sanctions reduced North Korea's manufacturing output by 12.9% and real income by 15%. Similarly, Kim 2023 analyzed IPUS survey on North Korean defectors and reported that household income decreased by 25% on average during 2017 to 2019 compared to 2014 to 2016. And another important aspect of the impact of sanction is about North Korea's foreign currency reserves. It is well known that the sanctions curtail export much significantly than import. So the trade deficit exceeded $2 billion from 2017 to 2019, leading to reductions in foreign exchange reserves. This is in contrast to the pre-sanction periods when North Korea had positive foreign exchange balance by expanding surpluses in factor income, current transfers, services, and capital account. And the North Korean economy is partially recovered from the recession induced by the external shocks in 2023. The post-pandemic economy recovery is led by increased trade with China following the border reopening. In August 2022, North Korean authorities declared victory over COVID-19 and partially opened the borders. And in 2023, trade with China more than doubled to $2.3 billion US dollars. And North Korea exported $0.3 billion US dollars to China, which exceeds the pre-pandemic level, and import $2.0 billion US dollars, which is 78% of 2019 level. And the table in this slide show major items in North Korea's trade with China in 2023. North Korea's export have been highly concentrated on a small number of items. In 2023, North Korea exported $1.7 billion of human hair products, more than half of the total export. And major imports are diverse, including textile raw materials, edible products, and plastic goods. And Russia haven't revealed its trade data since 2022, but trade between North Korea and Russia is suspected to have expanded since the summit in September 2023. The export of artillery shells from North Korea to Russia has been extensively reported in both media and export articles. And we can expect North Korea to receive food and energy in exchange for the conditional munitions. The official quantity of Russia's refined oil export have been under the 500,000 barrel ceiling imposed by the sanctions, but it is widely believed that the illicit export by ship-to-ship transfer have far exceeded the ceiling. Crop production also rose to 4.8 million tons due to resumed fertilizer imports and favorable weather conditions. And grain imports from China is doubled, so it seems that food shortage in North Korea have been elevated to some extent. And when we consider the future of the North Korean economy, it's likely that its trajectory of recovery will be significantly influenced by changes in the geopolitical landscape. Current geopolitical situation seems favorable to North Korea's short-term economic outlook. First, the original UN Security Council resolution is not able to be enforced due to the veto power of China and Russia. Second, the monitoring for violation of sanctions can also be loosened. As we already talked about, the UNS panel of experts, which is responsible for monitoring the sanctions compliance, is scheduled to conclude its operations by the end of April. And third, the prolonged Russia-Ukraine war is providing new opportunities for the North Korean economy. It is believed that North Korea is exporting a large amount of artillery shells to Russia, and it's also expected that North Korea will dispatch construction workers for restoration project after the ceasefire. And North Korean workers dispatched to Russia were forced to pay a monthly quota of $600 a month, which is much higher amount than in the cases in China. So it can be quite helpful for North Korean foreign exchange balance. However, economic cooperation between North Korea and Russia is unlikely to expand beyond the sectors related to war. There are several reasons. First, Russia's trade structure is quite similar with that of North Korea. Major export are raw materials and major import are durable consumer goods, including smartphones, televisions, computers. And North Korea is likely to demand petroleum oil import from Russia, but have nothing to export to Russia other than military munitions. Second, the transportation cost is much higher compared to trading with China. And third, there is a possibility that Russia will attempt to rebuild relations with Western countries after the war. In the case, Russia will not be free to violate sanctions as it is now. So North Korea's long-term economic outlook seems to depend more on Chinese policy toward the sanctions. Import of capital goods and export of coal are potential key drivers of future economic recovery of North Korea. And both are banned by the UN sanctions. So yeah, the bottom left figures show that the quantity of North Korean coal export in the post-sanction period accounts for maximum 20 to 30% of that in the pre-sanction period. And the figure in the bottom right side, the capital goods import in 2023 was just 2% of the pre-sanction period. So it's expected that the looser Chinese enforcement of sanctions against North Korea, the faster North Korea's future economic recovery will be. And the last thing I'd like to note in this presentation is North Korea's own economic policy. During the pandemic, North Korean authority has moved to strengthen state control over markets and foreign trade. It tried to restore the state-exclusive foreign trade system and centralize the grain sales in the market. However, North Korea's policy toward expanding cooperation with China and Russia can undermine the internal control. It can increase people's exposure to external information. For example, when deciding to dispatch workers overseas, North Korean authority may be worried about increasing defections. And yeah, that's all I prepared. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Jungmin. I think you pointed out very interesting facts or your analysis about China's leverage here. So I think we can discuss that a little bit more after we finish this presentation by each speaker. Eric, I think the bottom line today is what we're going to do about the sanctions. So we may not be in an ideal situation to quote unquote fine tune them, given the situation at the UN Security Council. So Eric, I think you have the last word here.
Great. Thanks very much. It's been fascinating listening to our fellow participants. Thank you very much for the invitation to participate in this seminar. I originally agreed to talk about fine-tuning the sanctions regime. However, in my view, this really would be the definition of fiddling whilst Rome burns. Fine-tuning only really has a point when a machine is working, and it's a bit silly if the machine lies in broken pieces at your feet. With Russia's recent veto of the renewal of the mandate, the continuing non-implementation of UN sanctions by both China and Russia, and the alarming development of DPRK weapons systems over the past few years, I frankly believe that some much more fundamental thinking, firstly about the aims of sanctions, secondly about the future of monitoring, and thirdly, implementation needs to be done. Firstly, the sanctions themselves, for better or worse, are still in place. They remain the unanimously agreed position of the UN Security Council, and in many parts of the world, they are incorporated into domestic legislation. It's illegal to break UN sanctions. Designed originally and primarily as a peaceful means to prevent DPRK from developing weapons of mass destruction, the regime also served as a clearly stated warning to other states which might have been considering the development of such weapons. But there were, of course, other aims as well, not least of which was a peaceful resolution of political tensions on the Korean Peninsula. Lifting sanctions would be a perverse reward for DPRK for its behavior, and I don't support that at all. But I do think that the aims of the sanctions against DPRK need to be reviewed and restated, if not by the UN, then by those who are interested in maintaining them. My question is simply, what are the sanctions there to achieve? Once that's clear, and I stress that it's not my job to answer that question, a monitoring mechanism might be re-established. The panel did some things very well. It had the authority of the UN. States and entities and individuals were obliged to assist its investigations, and its reports were agreed by consensus. It had very high evidential standards in recent years. Its identification of maritime evasion methodology and its identification of the importance of crypto crime to the DPRK were amply evidenced with investigative detail drawn from a lot of sources. The panel's referencing of recent developments in DPRK's missile programs will also be useful to scholars for years, I imagine. The panel maintained a wide network of collaborative relationships ranging from cooperative states to individual investigative journalists, all helping selflessly to expose sanctions evasion. The panel's reports probably didn't add greatly to the understanding of developments in DPRK of countries which have a strategic interest in the Korean Peninsula. But it was a regular and reliable resource for the vast majority of UN member states, and the only means by which they could understand their detailed responsibilities and obligations. And the panel played an important role in improving customs and export control mechanisms in many states in this way. However, the panel was far from perfect. Its composition, with its membership drawn from the P5 countries, Japan and ROK, and then one other country, and its rules of consensus meant that the panel increasingly could not report frankly on sanctions evasion from China and Russia. Even cooperative member states were increasingly reluctant to share valuable intelligence with a body which was unable to follow up or report on that information. And increasingly complex investigations were conducted by a small group of diplomats using woefully underpowered IT systems rather than dedicated and specialized investigators. That said, it might well be possible to create a body which could replicate and even improve some of the work of the panel. I think that body would be best outside the UN. The UN's rules perversely prevent uncensored and objective reporting. Well-evidenced objective reporting of sanctions evasion is something that journalists and think tanks around the world already produce. And there's a wealth of expertise out there which could help. Such a body would require the continuing information support of nation states. And it would, I think, benefit from coming under the wing of an international body, the G7 possibly, whilst really stringently maintaining its independence and objectivity. It would require some modern IT and a dedicated staff, including, critically, a legal team. And of course, none of this is very cheap. The effort and expense of trying to replicate the panel's work outside the UN would require an even more fundamental problem being addressed, however. Monitoring the regime effectively and identifying the loopholes is important, but it's actually less important than implementation. What matters most in the achievement of the aims of a sanctions regime is that the measures are actually enforced. States only rarely took any concrete action on the panel's recommendations. ROK's numerous enforcement actions and the diplomatic lobbying work conducted globally on the basis of the panel's reports by both the EU and the US deserve honourable mention. But by contrast, and as we've heard, the commercial world was eager to take action on every detail contained in the report. Companies, vessels, and individuals involved in sanctions evasion, bank accounts, contact details, all of this information, carefully researched and verified by the panel, was used by banks, insurance companies, and due diligence departments to take action against sanctions evasion. It was largely unseen, except for by those who were part of it, but these actions played an important role in imposing real-world consequences on those engaged in sanctions evasion. And I believe that the relationships between the panel and the commercial world had the most real impact on sanctions. I think there may be lessons here for the future. As we've heard today, consistent and serious implementation of the UN sanctions regime has been a fundamental problem for some years. DPRK's own response to COVID did far more than UN sanctions to close DPRK's borders. Whatever was agreed at the meeting between Chinese President Xi and Kim Jong-un in June 2019, from that point, Chinese enforcement of sanctions was indifferent at the very best. And of course, the Russian invasion of Ukraine marked a clear endpoint to Russian enforcement of the regime, although implementation had been patchy for years before that. Neither Russia nor China have done anything to enforce DPRK sanctions in several years. And the presence of Chinese and Russian experts on the panel has meant that the panel's reports have not been able to highlight these enormous and critical loopholes in the regime. The national embarrassment of being mentioned in the panel's reports is really the only penalty that states have to endure if their nationals are found to be involved in sanctions evasion. And increasingly, that was of very little import. China has found that it only has to claim faithfully and solemnly to implement sanctions, producing no evidence whatsoever of actually doing anything of the sort in order to deflect criticism. Russia has seemed not to care at all about exposure of its weapons imports from and oil exports to DPRK, although the veto suggests that Russian patience with the panel has finally come to an end. The question is therefore pretty fundamental: how to ensure that non-implementation of the sanctions regime has a consequence. This regime was unanimously agreed by the UN Security Council. But when two permanent members of the same body are doing nothing to implement those sanctions, what happens? Why should others implement sanctions if Russia and China don't? What's the penalty, and how does the UN respond? I personally believe that the lessons from the commercial world may hold at least some of the answer. Sanctions evasion is primarily about money flows. If individuals and entities can't profit from involvement, they're much less likely to become involved. Secondary sanctions on dollar transactions are deeply unpopular, and politically they can have major implications which need to be balanced against other national and international priorities. Nobody really wants a trade war with China. But secondary sanctions on dollar transactions have been shown to work. Time's up. Sadly, I don't have the questions to any of the questions I've asked, but clearly they are big questions which unfortunately go well beyond fine-tuning. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Eric. Thank you for sharing your insights and your experiences from your last position at the UN panel of experts. I think it really enlightened us in terms of how to deal with this sanctions on North Korea down the road. Before I open it up for a brief roundtable discussion among the speakers, I'd like to remind the audience that we are taking questions from you, and the Q&A box is already open. So when you type in your questions, please make sure to identify your name and affiliation. So before I take some questions from the audience, I'd like to throw in this broad question which Eric raised. He said lifting sanctions wouldn't be a good idea. At this time, we need to start to think about review the aims of sanctions against North Korea. What are they there to achieve? Wonder if Eric didn't really want to step in to answer this question, but if you have other thoughts, please do so. But I'd like to ask other speakers to speak up on this issue. What's your thoughts on this? Nobody wants to answer, I guess.
Kim Ho, if I could sort of add to that, I mean, there is a huge elephant in the room on this issue. The sanctions are there to prevent DPRK from developing its weapons of mass destruction, but it has developed weapons of mass destruction. I mean, I'm not saying that sanctions haven't had an effect. They've obviously slowed that process for a long time. And touch wood, there hasn't been a war, which is obviously what sanctions are there to avoid happening. But North Korea does have these weapons of mass destruction, and yet the sanctions regime has not changed in order to reflect that fact. Now, as I say, I don't support the lifting of sanctions in any way. Indeed, I think lifting sanctions would actually make very little effect because sanctions are barely being implemented at all now. But so I don't support the lifting of sanctions. But actually, I think it's really important that the UN won't be able to say anything, won't be able to agree a purpose for sanctions. So the people who are interested in these sanctions, the US, ROK, the EU, my own country, they need to be able to state clearly what the sanctions are for. Now, that may be punitive. It may be a message to other countries that are thinking about developing weapons of mass destruction. Do not do this. There are consequences if you try to do this. But I think it needs to be really clearly stated, because otherwise the regime is vulnerable to criticism from Russia, particularly, about what they're there for. And Russia obviously can conclude they need to be lifted because actually they failed and they're causing enormous humanitarian damage. This is a real danger because Russia's position on this is entirely wrong. But they are able to point to failings in the international community's definition of what the sanctions are there for.
Thank you, Eric. I understand that there are more and more people, including senior government officials in the US and Korea, South Korea, I mean, talking about creating an entity outside the UN that will continue the monitoring of sanctions that the UN panel of experts have been doing. So probably if and when we have this new entity, it's going to be kind of cooperation among like-minded states. And I wonder if this could be more effective or more promising in terms of monitoring and reporting the implementations of sanctions on North Korea.
Are you asking me?
I think Janda has some thoughts, so let me ask him to speak first.
Oh yeah, no, I was just gonna say, I mean, I think, like I said in my comments, there, could be something put in place that's definitely more effective. But again, I think the issue, also that I think Eric was kind of touching upon was that, right, if it's outside the, if it's maybe outside the UN or something like that, I think it can be more easily attacked by China and Russia, saying that it's not objective, or that it's serving Western aims or something like that. But then on the other hand, if it's set up under a different structure and China and Russia aren't involved, then I think it can go even more in depth than what the panel of experts has done. I mean, when you look at reports by like RUSI or C4ADS kind of going in, if you think that they could, there could be like a new body that maybe has the access to the same information that the panel of experts had, but able to kind of maybe go more the direction that those kind of reports from other non-governmental organizations were able to really drill down into these issues. I think that could definitely be more useful. And I mean, I guess in some ways, right, because of geopolitical issues, the world's already divided. The countries that will accept the panel of that already accept the panel of experts would likely accept this new whatever this new structure is that is reporting on North Korean, their illicit activity. In the countries that kind of were against what was going on, the panel will still be against it. But also, yeah, like from my experience, I think definitely banks and financial institutions and other companies, really find these types of reports to be extremely valuable, because the information that the banks see is like, it's a very vital sliver, but it's a very small sliver of information compared to like everything that the panel has access to. So it's definitely something that's extremely useful that for the private sector, and I think that they would continue to find it useful if the panel was able to be revived in some format.
Thank you, Janda. Eric, I think you can take one of the questions from the audience. This is directed to you regarding the question I just asked. So this question is from Troy Stangarone, one of our North Korean Economic Forum Steering Committee members. So Eric, you mentioned that any new body should be nested in an international institution, and suggested perhaps the G7. That is a very limited group. Do you think there would be a benefit in including other countries in Asia beyond South Korea and Japan, or countries from other places where North Korea has engaged in illicit activities, such as Africa or the Middle East?
I simply mentioned the G7 because I'm lazy. Of course, whichever body is created, I think it would benefit from some of the simply administrative support that an already established international grouping has. But of course, that's not to be at all prescriptive about who can lean in to the work of such a body, and anyone would be welcome. Of course, DPRK sanctions evasion is a global issue, and the panel's reports have consistently demonstrated that over the years, that sanctions evasion happens in the most unlikely of places around the globe. But that said, and all countries, all UN member states should have an interest in conforming to the sanctions regime and doing what they have to implement those the requirements. But I would say, as we heard earlier on today, that the vast majority of sanctions evasion comes from individuals and entities in China. China is responsible for the vast bulk of DPRK's trade, and so it's completely understandable that that sanctions evasion also comes from China. The panel's reports have not reflected that because the panel includes a Chinese expert who really doesn't want the panel to conclude that. And that's why I think an independent body, but outside the UN, would actually be far more effective in highlighting what's actually going on, rather than a sort of lowest common denominator type of reporting, which is censored fundamentally.
Thank you, Eric. Let me ask this question, Jung-min. You, in your presentations, you pointed out that the economic cooperation between North Korea and Russia would be a little bit limited compared to China. But I understand as far as the Far Eastern Russia is concerned, they have been really interested in expanding their economic cooperation with North Korea, but it was not successful in realizing their ambitions or plans. But now they're going through a very different situation now. So do you see any possibility of Russia, Far Eastern Russia, expanding their economic cooperation with North Korea?
그러니까 이제 러시아가 지금 보여주고 있는 태도는 제 생각에는 전쟁이라는
Currently, the
특수한 상황
position
속에서
Russia is showing is because under the special circumstances, which is the war with Ukraine, Russia-Ukraine war, in order to successfully finish the war, Russia wants North Korea to successfully supply the arms and weapons. And at post-war recovery, due to that, they're interested in workforces to construct, among others. And when it comes to Far East Russia, for example, the Duma River development plan is, as far as I am concerned, they have already discussed that issue in the past, and because the economic benefits is not that high. So due to various reasons, it has been delayed. And currently, the situation has not changed that much. So just like I mentioned in the presentation slides, if the war ends, there is a question, will Russia and North Korea really going to expand their relations, economic relations? So I personally have a skeptical viewpoint to this. That is my answer.
Thank you. And I'd like to ask one quick question, Sang-suk, about China's position. So your analysis concludes that China, being one of the two black knights, they're very unwilling to implement the sanctions, obviously, but I don't think they want North Korea getting closer to Russia either. So in this very complicated situations, what would be China's position in responding to any moves to create a new entity that will replace the UN panel of experts?
네, 일단 저도 이동민 박사님과 마찬가지로
First of all, I do agree with Dr. Jong-min Lee. The Russia-North Korean economic cooperation will be pretty much limited because the China-North Korean economic cooperation goes way back. It has a long history. Even during the Korean War, the history goes long back to the Korean War. They have a long history of cooperation. especially the three province that I mentioned. And also, there are many Chinese Korean and Korean Chinese. They have a huge network and they have a very close bond between the two. So China and North Korean economic cooperation will be really sticky because the bond is so strong. However, the Russian North Korean economic cooperation is led by the government. And I personally believe, well, it's not going to last for a long time after the war ended. However, in the case of China and North Korea, it is person to person. It is business to business economic ties between the two sides. So that is the biggest difference. To answer your question, Yonho, well, North Korea and Russia is now strengthening their security cooperation and even the economic cooperation. Yes. But in the case of the China, their stance is not that clear. Regarding the security cooperation between North Korea and Russia, China is stepping away from their ties because the security collaboration is pretty much limited and China does not want to have a stable Korean peninsula. China does not want North Korea to be fully dependent on Russia. So China will continue its economic cooperation or the collaboration with North Korea continuously. Especially this year is the friendly ties year between North Korea and China. They're going to focus more on IT and tourism cooperation. And I think this is the clear evidence for the continuous collaboration between China and North Korea. If there is a external entity which will replace POE, China will go against it. Obviously, yes. And they are not going to cooperate or they are not going to engage with it. And Russia, neither. China's central regime will say, yes, we comply with the regime. They are going to say like that, but at the local government level or the regional government level, it's not going to be fully implemented. That's not going to change.
Thank you, Sang-suk. Bomsu, did you have any comments or questions?
네, 지금 이상숙 선생님 답변하는 거 들으면서 사실은 아까
Well, listening to Professor Lee Sang-suk's answer, my question is similar to the former one. From China's viewpoint, and officially, there is a sanction, and unofficially, they're acting as a black knight for North Korea, creating a loophole for sanctions. So if they cross the line there, then it would be crossing the red line. For example, if North Korea crosses this line, then it's crossing the red line that they won't end it. Is there anything, for example, if North Korea runs another new nuclear test from China's viewpoint, if North Korea is too focused on nuclear development, or if North Korea becomes too close with Russia, if that happens, is there any chance that China will change their stance? And of course, they want to just smash North Korea's economy, but is there any potential possibility that they will strengthen the sanction on North Korea? So from Professor Lee Sang-suk, what is the line that if North Korea crosses, then they will strengthen the sanction?
So your question is about what can be the trigger. Yes, in my presentation, as I told you, in 2017 and 2018, because of the sanction, the trade between North Korea and China made a negative growth, as I told you, because of the sanction effect. And at that time, I believe China was quite compliant with the regime, I mean, the sanction regime. And that helped North Korea to come to the negotiation table. However, after 2019, well, the relations between North Korea and the US changed. And also, there was a conflict between China and North Korea. The tension was escalating between the two sides. China is not happy with the WMD development of North Korea. They do not agree with that. However, they want to have influence on North Korea. So I don't think China will not give up North Korea. When there is a significant change in the geopolitical issue, they might give up, but I don't think so. And also, when North Korea is hampering the stability of Korean Peninsula, I mean significantly, then China might change its position. Just developing WMD might not change the status or the stance of China to North Korea. When there is a significant change on the stability or on the peace on the Korean Peninsula, then China can turn its position and can be more stringent against North Korea.
So is there any standard? For example, nuclear tests won't be the one.
자체적으로 하는 핵실험 가지고는 중국이
The
움직일
North Korea's nuclear test would not change the stance of China. I believe if there is a significant action between the two Koreas and when there is a huge conflict between the two, then probably China will make a different action.
Thank you. Let me take a question from Celeste Arrington, one of GWIKS core faculty here. Her question is, commercial banks and firms' responses to a panel of experts, reports, and news coverage of DPRK activity has been relatively robust, as Janda and Eric chronicled. Are there any signs of sanctions implementation, quote-unquote, fatigue, or weakening consensus in the banking or business world mirroring the challenges at the UN? I think both Janda and Eric, this question is directed to.
Yeah, maybe I'll just say quickly, I don't think there's necessarily any fatigue from the bank side. In fact, you know, even maybe 5 years ago, I think banks were a lot more unclear about what like proliferation finance was. It was maybe just kind of under the broader umbrella of sanctions. But I think more recently, banks have really begun to understand the distinct nature of how proliferation finance differs from just general sanctions evasion. So I think banks' awareness over time, maybe while definitely lagging a bit, continues to grow. So I think there's no fatigue in that sense. And I mean, right, in the end of the day, for large financial institutions, international ones that are, operating around the globe, right? I mean, they don't want to come under the scrutiny of regulators. They just want to be able to conduct their business. So they're going to be a little more proactive, I think, in that sense, because they would like to, stay ahead of not wanting to violate sanctions. And especially with, countries like, dealing with North Korea, there's, for most, pretty much all these international banks, there's no benefit for them to actively try and seek to subvert sanctions or anything like that. So I'd say that there's not a fatigue. It's just these banks always want to better understand what are the requirements of, your national regulators, like, what for the US, what is OFAC saying, what is, FinCEN saying, and really being able to apply that to the bank systems. But yeah, I'd say no real fatigue at least for now. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'll entirely agree with that. I think sanctions fatigue is something that happens at a state level. It's what happens to diplomats. For bankers, sanctions and abiding by sanctions is existential. Their business stops if they get caught up in sanctions. They don't make any money. Their partners go bust. So it's part of their world. They don't get tired of it because this is what they live. So no, I don't think there's any banking fatigue on sanctions because they take it seriously.
Great.
예, 감사합니다.
I think we have two questions
질문을
for
한 두 개 정도 더 볼 수 있을 것 같아요.
so one is from Bill Newcomb.
윌리엄 뉴컴 선생님 질문이 있는데요.
So for Dr. Lee, exports for munitions and
이 박사님 질문입니다.
were drawn from
미사일이나 아니면은 무기의 수출을 보게 되면은
but as it continues, earnings and counterparts imports are highly likely to increasingly stimulate the second economy. So how do you assess the consequences for the North Korean economy at large? And the second question is from Bracken. Jungmin briefly mentioned North Korea's re-centralization efforts. How do these efforts interact with sanctions pressure? Are they likely to insulate Pyongyang from economic pressure or to compound problems? So if you can answer these two questions briefly, Jungmin, that'll be great.
네, 먼저 윌리엄
First of
뉴컴
all, I would like to answer William Newcomb's question. As you have mentioned so far, North Korea has been exporting the stocks that they have been storing. So there is news that they exported 1 million, which is about 3 million US dollars or 600 US dollars. And say if the demand is keep increasing for a long period of time because of the Russian-Ukraine war and North Korea now has no stockpile, then they have to produce and export, then that will increase North Korea's GDP, and secondary, it will increase their industrial activity. And say North Korea's GDP, it will account for 1.5%, which is not a small number. But if in order for North Korea to keep producing the goods, then North Korea factories and stockpiles, the factories are old-fashioned. So in the end, they'll have to contact China or other countries to import factory facilities. That is my viewpoint. So if it happens, then if it works, then it will give a surplus for North Korea's economy. But I question the feasibility realistically. And the second question is, and question by Bracken. So I would say two different ideas, just like I mentioned from my presentation. So there's a trade-off situation. North Korea refocuses, and if they want to get rid of it, then they have to cut off the external information coming into North Korea. And even if Russia and China loosens the sanction, and there's possibility that North Korea by itself will strengthen the sanction. And secondary, North Korea's economy was increasing back in 2010s, where trade with China was very active, and that was creating a virtuous cycle back then. And one of the cycles was that by suppressing the cycle, but now it is showing some side effects. So if the sanction loosens, but still the benefiting factor will be limited due to North Korea's policy.
Thank you. I think we have one last subtopic to discuss before we conclude today. I think the North Korea's illicit crypto activities is getting more and more attention from the countries all over the world, especially the United States. I think is putting more efforts to deal with this issue. So in the changing the sanctions landscape, how do you think, I'm just asking this question, throwing this as a question to all the speakers. How do you think this illicit crypto activities by North Korea will evolve or will be dealt with in the changing sanctions landscape? Yes, Eric?
Well, I think as the panel has demonstrated, this is a critical part of North Korea's sanctions evasion strategy. Simply stealing money from a computer based in Pyongyang is much easier than doing anything else, and it's much more lucrative as well. We did a lot of work on this in the panel while I was there, and clearly the two reports that the panel has issued this year have continued that work on crypto crime. It's really important. But fundamentally, cryptocurrency is only money. This is all about money, and actually it's very, very difficult to buy pieces of missiles with cryptocurrency. At some point in the process, stolen cryptocurrency funds have to be transferred into normal money, and that involves financial institutions. And I'm afraid, although might not be surprised to hear it, but most of the financial institutions involved in transforming this cryptocurrency into normal currency for missile parts and for the purchase of oil and so on and so forth by North Korea are based in China. And that is a really fundamental problem, because no matter what the US and indeed the ROK do on fighting the crypto crime itself, the processing of cryptocurrency through Chinese financial institutions is the real problem that has to be addressed in order to stop DPRK making these enormous sums of money simply by stealing it.
Thank you. Janda, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, I think definitely one trend that North Korea has shown is, they're very sophisticated actors when it comes to this. So I think one trend in the future is they're always a step ahead when there's some kind of new innovation in the crypto realm. Like, North Korean hackers will be the first to try and figure out a way to exploit it. And then, but yeah, like Eric said, the real issue is changing the money into fiat currency, right? And as you pointed out, many banks, I think, in the West, are to varying degrees, still skeptical about crypto. So, they look at, crypto exchanges or people who are moving a lot of crypto through their accounts with, a higher level of, I guess, concern, not necessarily suspicion, but concern. So, I mean, I think that, that is definitely a roadblock in the West if North Korea is trying to use, non-Chinese banks to move that money. But yeah, it seems like there's that stalemate in the sense that, a lot of like these firms that do crypto investigations, right? They can see which wallets North Korea controls, and they just see that the money's sitting there, because North Korea is also trying to figure out how can they move it without being identified. So it's something, but I think the biggest thing to look out for is they're always going to be on the cutting edge of new crypto innovations and trying to be the first to get in there to be able to steal money and create chaos.
Okay, thank you, Janda. With that, I'd like to thank all the distinguished speakers for joining us today, especially our Korean speakers for staying up late at night for us. Hopefully you will have a good night's sleep there. I'd also like to thank our GWIKS team for putting this together, and the simultaneous interpreters for their excellent service. And of course, thank you all for joining us. With that, let me conclude today's webinar. Thank you.